The first thing I heard was my mother's voice, sharp and cutting through the quiet of the night like glass shattering against a floor. I wasn't expecting her, and neither was Grandma, who had gone pale the moment the knocking started. My mother's tone was raw, breathless, like she had been running, but that didn't explain the absolute fury in her voice when she called my name through the door. I hesitated, looking at Grandma, but her fingers tightened around my wrist in a grip that was stronger than I thought an old woman could manage. "Don't," she whispered, but there was something desperate in her eyes, something that unsettled me, because this wasn't just about a mother-daughter feud anymore. There was fear in her voice, real fear, and it rattled me in a way I didn't know how to process. My mother pounded on the door harder, her voice rising, demanding I open it, and I felt my pulse quicken as I glanced between them, caught in the middle of something I didn't understand. The whole thing had gone from confusing to terrifying in a matter of seconds, and I hated the way my hands were shaking when I finally yanked free of Grandma's grip and stepped toward the door. The second I opened it, my mother shoved past me, her breath heavy, her hair sticking to her face with sweat, and her eyes wild in a way I had never seen before. She didn't even acknowledge me at first. Her gaze locked onto Grandma, who was still sitting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap like she had been expecting this moment for years. There was something unreadable on Grandma's face, not anger, not guilt, but something like quiet resignation, and that, more than anything, sent a chill up my spine. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't just another argument. This was something else, something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long, long time. My mother pointed a shaking finger at Grandma, her voice hoarse. "You don't get to do this," she hissed, and I could see her whole body trembling with something I didn't recognize, grief, maybe, or something darker, something heavier. Grandma tilted her head, her lips pressing together in that way people do when they know exactly how something is going to play out, but still find it disappointing. "Do what, Lillian?" she asked softly, and the calmness in her voice seemed to push my mother closer to the edge. My mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh, but it was hollow, empty. She turned to me, finally acknowledging my presence, and the look in her eyes made my stomach drop. "She's lying to you," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "She's always lied to you." I frowned, glancing back at Grandma, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, just sat there watching my mother with something that almost looked like pity. "Mom," I started, trying to calm her down, trying to understand what the hell was happening, but she cut me off, her voice rising. "No, you don't get to defend her. You don't know what she's done. You don't know what she stopped, her voice cracking, and she ran a hand through her hair, exhaling shakily, like she was struggling to keep herself from breaking apart right in front of me. Grandma finally spoke again, and her voice was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it. "You never wanted her to know." My mother turned on her like a storm ready to break, and I could see the tears in her eyes now, but they weren't just from anger, they were from pain, from something that had been festering inside of her for years, something that was eating her alive. "I didn't want her to know because you don't deserve to be the one to tell her," she spat, and there was a sharp, guttural quality to her voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't get to act like you're the victim in this. You don't get to sit there like some frail old woman and pretend like you didn't ruin everything." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a slow, creeping realization that whatever this was, it wasn't just about them. It was about me. And it had always been about me. Grandma exhaled slowly, then looked at me with something I couldn't quite place, something like sorrow, or regret, or maybe even love. "She deserves the truth," she said, and I heard my mother suck in a sharp breath, like the words had physically hurt her. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to think, didn't know who to believe, but my heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I could feel it in my throat. "What truth?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I wanted it to. My mother closed her eyes for a moment, like she was trying to steady herself, but when she opened them again, they were filled with something raw, something that made my stomach twist. "The truth about what happened to your father," she said, and in that moment, it felt like the entire room had been sucked of air. I felt lightheaded, unsteady, my mind racing to catch up with her words, because my father was dead. He had been dead since I was a baby. There was no mystery, no secrets, no unanswered questions. But when I looked back at Grandma, I saw the truth in her eyes before she even spoke. "You only know the story she wanted you to know," Grandma murmured, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too quiet, even though my mother's breathing was uneven and sharp, and I could hear the faint creak of the couch under Grandma's weight as she finally leaned forward. My hands felt cold, and I didn't know if it was from anger or confusion or something else I hadn't identified yet. My mother wiped at her face quickly, but her hands were shaking, and I had never seen her like this before. She was always the composed one, the one who kept everything together, the one who never let emotions spill over. But right now, she looked like a woman unraveling, and it terrified me more than whatever secret they were keeping from me. She took a step closer, like she wanted to shield me from something, but there was no undoing this. Whatever was about to be said was something I wasn't meant to hear, something she had spent years making sure I never found out. Her mouth opened, but Grandma beat her to it, her voice steady even though I could see her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt, gripping tight like she was holding onto something invisible. "He's not dead," Grandma said, and I felt the words hit me in the chest before my mind could even process them. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might be sick, and my legs felt weak, like the ground wasn't stable anymore. I could see my mother close her eyes, shaking her head, whispering something under her breath like she was trying to convince herself that this wasn't happening. I almost laughed, because there was no way, absolutely no way, that this was true. It was impossible. It was cruel. It was a lie. But Grandma wasn't looking at me like someone who had just dropped a lie into the middle of the room and was waiting for the fallout. She was watching me with something softer, something almost like relief, like she had been carrying this for so long and finally, the weight was coming off. I couldn't find my voice at first, my mouth opening and closing as I tried to force something out, anything, but my mother beat me to it, stepping forward with a raw, desperate sound in her throat, her eyes wide and frantic in a way I had never seen before. "Do not listen to her," she snapped, but I barely heard her because my heart was pounding too hard, and I couldn't look away from Grandma. "He's dead," she continued, her voice lower now, but it didn't sound as sure as it always had before. "You know that. You've always known that. She only told you what she wanted you to believe," Grandma said, and this time, I did laugh, but it was hollow and shaking and felt wrong coming out of my mouth. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like I had been pulled out of my life and shoved into someone else's without warning. "What the hell are you saying?" I finally managed, and my voice cracked in a way I hated, but I couldn't focus on that right now. "What does that even mean? Are you seriously telling me that my father, my dead father, the one I never got to meet, the one she's talked about my whole life, is alive?" "Yes," Grandma said, and my mother made a sound that I didn't know how to describe, something like pain and fury and devastation all at once. I turned to her so fast my vision blurred for a second, but she didn't look at me, only at Grandma, like she was staring at someone she wanted to destroy. "You don't get to do this," my mother whispered, and I wasn't sure if it was a threat or a plea, but it didn't matter because I wasn't listening to her anymore. My whole life had just been flipped upside down, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand why this was happening now, why it had been hidden from me for so long. "Where is he?" I asked, and my mother turned to me so sharply that I flinched. "No," she said immediately, and there was something broken in her voice now, something that almost made me hesitate. "Almost. You don't get to ask that. You don't get to tell her the truth," Grandma interrupted, and my mother let out a harsh breath, like she had just been slapped. "You don't have to like it, but she has a right to know." I had never seen my mother like this, never seen her look so lost and furious at the same time. "You don't understand," she finally said, but her voice cracked again, and I hated the way my chest ached at the sound of it. "You don't," she stopped, pressing her fingers against her forehead like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart completely. "Where is he?" I asked again, and this time, Grandma didn't hesitate. Prison, she said, and the word was so sharp, so sudden, that I almost didn't register it at first. My body locked up, and my breath caught, and everything inside of me went completely still. What? Grandma nodded, her face unreadable now. He's been in prison since before you were born, she said, and my hands were shaking, my pulse hammering in my ears so loudly that I barely heard her when she kept talking. Your mother never wanted you to know, because she thought it would be easier for you. She thought it would protect you. I turned to my mother, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her arms were wrapped around herself tightly, like she was trying to hold herself together, like if she let go, she would completely collapse. I could feel something rising in my chest, something I couldn't control, something that was making my vision blur and my skin prickle and my heart ache. Why? I asked, and my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. Why the hell would you lie about that? Why would you? You think I wanted this for you? My mother snapped, and her voice was shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You think I wanted you to grow up knowing that your father was a criminal? That he wasn't some hero who died, but someone who... She stopped abruptly, shutting her eyes tightly, like she was trying to push something back down, something she didn't want to say. I felt sick. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. I felt like I was standing in the middle of something that had already swallowed me whole before I even had a chance to fight it. What did he do? I asked, and I barely recognized my own voice. My mother inhaled sharply, but she didn't answer. Grandma did. Murder. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stood there, frozen, as the words settled over me like a weight I didn't know how to carry. The word didn't make sense at first, like I had misheard or my brain refused to accept it, but the way Grandma said it, steady and clear without hesitation, left no room for misunderstanding. My mother inhaled sharply like she had been physically struck, her whole body flinching, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, but she didn't argue, didn't deny it, didn't tell Grandma she was lying. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't push off. I felt like I wasn't standing in my own life anymore, like I had somehow walked into someone else's nightmare, except every part of this was real, and I was right in the center of it. My father, the man I had spent my whole life believing was gone, the man my mother had painted as some distant, tragic memory, was not only alive, but had been locked away for something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family. I forced myself to breathe, to speak, to make sense of something that felt impossible. Murder? My voice came out unsteady, too quiet, but my mother's reaction was anything but. Her head snapped up, her eyes wild with something I didn't recognize, something between anger and desperation. No, she said immediately, her voice sharp, but I could hear the panic underneath it, the way it wavered just enough to make my stomach twist. That's not... She stopped herself, shaking her head like she could erase the moment, reset the conversation, shove everything back into the place she had carefully constructed for the last 20 years, but it was too late. He killed a man, Grandma said, and this time my mother let out a choked sound, something like frustration and grief tangled together. She doesn't need to hear this, my mother snapped, turning toward me, but there was something pleading in her voice now, something almost frantic. This is not who you are, this isn't your life, you don't need to. I need to know. I cut her off, and I could feel my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. You don't get to decide that anymore. I turned to Grandma, and I saw the way her expression shifted, something softer, something that almost looked like guilt. Who? I asked, and the word felt heavier than it should have. Who did he kill? She hesitated for the first time, and that hesitation sent a jolt of something cold through my veins. My mother stepped forward again, but I didn't look at her this time, keeping my eyes locked on Grandma, waiting, demanding. Who? I repeated, my voice sharper now, the edges of my patience fraying. Grandma exhaled slowly, and when she spoke, I felt everything inside of me lock up. Your mother's fiancé. It was like the floor dropped out from under me, my body swaying slightly before I caught myself, my brain struggling to catch up with the words that had just left her mouth. I turned to my mother so quickly my vision blurred for a second, and I saw the way her whole body stiffened, the way her breath hitched, the way she couldn't look at me. I had never seen her cry, not once in my life, not even when she talked about my dead father, but there were tears now, ones she was blinking back furiously, refusing to let fall. I didn't know what to say, didn't know where to start, didn't know how to ask the questions piling up in my head faster than I could make sense of them. "You were engaged?" I asked, and my voice didn't sound right, didn't sound like mine, didn't even feel like it came from my own throat. "Yes," she whispered, and I watched her close her eyes like she didn't want to be here, like she wanted to escape this moment completely. "Before you were born." There was something breaking inside of me, something unraveling that I couldn't control, something that was shifting the entire foundation of my existence. "And he killed him?" I asked, and my mother sucked in a sharp breath, her hands shaking now as she pressed them against her face for a moment before dragging them back down, forcing herself to look at me. "He wasn't always like that," she whispered, and I didn't know if she was saying it for me or for herself. "He wasn't. He loved me. I loved him. I really, really loved him." Her voice cracked, and she exhaled shakily. But something changed. My chest was too tight, my breathing uneven, my whole body tense like I was bracing for a collision. "Changed how?" She let out a bitter, broken laugh, shaking her head slightly. "He became possessive. Controlling. Angry." She swallowed hard. "I thought I could fix it, thought it was just stress, thought it was something we could get through together. But then I met Daniel." Hearing his name made my stomach twist, made my skin feel too tight, like I was wearing someone else's body, because this wasn't supposed to be my life. This wasn't supposed to be my family story. "And he didn't like that," I said, and I wasn't sure if it was a question or just me trying to force myself to understand something that felt too big, too much. My mother let out a sharp, humorless exhale. "No," she said simply, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of carrying this for so long. "He lost it. He stalked me. Followed me everywhere. Called me 100 times a day. He showed up at my work, at my apartment, screaming at me, begging me to come back, promising things would be different. I knew I had to get away, knew I had to leave, but I was scared. So I stayed quiet, tried to ignore him, tried to move on without making a scene. I already knew where this was going, already knew how it ended, but I needed to hear it anyway." "What happened?" My mother closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. "Daniel proposed," she whispered, and I barely heard her over the sound of my own heartbeat. "And I said yes." I could feel it before she even said the words, could feel it in the way her breath hitched, in the way her hands trembled, in the way her whole body seemed to shrink in on itself. "The night before our wedding," she continued, her voice hollow now, "he broke into our apartment and stabbed him. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, impossible to breathe in. I felt like I was drowning in something I couldn't see, something I didn't know how to fight. My hands were shaking, my vision blurring slightly at the edges, but I forced myself to stay standing, to stay present, to not let this consume me. "And you were pregnant with me," I said quietly, and I watched my mother nod once, her face unreadable now, too many emotions clashing together at once. "I never wanted you to know," she admitted, her voice raw, strained, like she had been holding it all in for so long and was just now letting it bleed out. "I wanted you to have a normal life. A safe life. One where he was just gone and not," she exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair. "Not this." I didn't know what to feel, didn't know how to move past something like this, didn't know what the hell I was supposed to do with the fact that the man who was half of me had done something so horrific. "And now?" I asked, and my voice felt detached, like it was coming from someone else. "Why now?" Grandma exhaled slowly, like she had been waiting for this part, like she had been dreading it. "Because he's getting out." The words hit harder than anything else that had been said tonight, heavier than the revelation that my father was alive, heavier than the truth about what he had done, heavier than the years of lies my mother had built around me like a carefully constructed cage. He was getting out. The man who had murdered my mother's fiancé, The man she had spent my entire life making sure I never knew existed, was about to be free. My body locked up, my mind struggling to process the reality of it, my heartbeat so loud in my ears that I almost didn't hear the way my mother exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her so tightly that her knuckles went white. She shook her head, her whole body tense with something that looked like rage and something that felt like pure, undiluted terror. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, controlled, almost cold. "No, he isn't," she said, and it wasn't a question, wasn't doubt, wasn't fear, it was a statement, an absolute, a fact she refused to let be untrue. "He can't be." Grandma didn't argue, didn't challenge her, just nodded once like she had expected this exact reaction. "He is," she said simply, and my mother let out a sharp breath, pressing her fingers against her forehead for a moment before looking up again, her expression hardening in a way I had never seen before. "How?" she demanded, her voice clipped, controlled, but I could see the cracks beneath it, the panic barely held together. "He got life. He was never supposed to get out." Reduced sentence, Grandma said, and I felt a sick sort of nausea churn in my stomach at how casually she said it, like she wasn't talking about a man who had destroyed lives, a man who had spent decades in a cage for something violent, something brutal, something that had rewritten the entire course of my mother's life. Good behavior, overcrowding, appeals, does it matter? She exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "He's out in 3 weeks." My mother turned away abruptly, her fingers gripping her hair, pulling slightly like she was trying to ground herself, like she was trying not to scream. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "No, no, no." I could feel something in the room shifting, something boiling just beneath the surface, something that had been waiting years to break through, and now that it had, there was no stopping it. My whole body felt tense, my fingers digging into my palms so hard they ached, my mind racing to keep up with something I didn't even want to understand. "So what does he want?" I asked, and Grandma turned her attention back to me, studying me for a long moment before answering. "You," she said, and the nausea in my stomach turned into something colder, something sharper, something that made my breath catch in my throat. My mother spun around so fast that the chair she had been gripping nearly tipped over, her eyes wide with something bordering on hysteria. "No," she snapped, and she was shaking now, barely able to hold back whatever was threatening to spill over. "No, he does not get to. He doesn't." "He's been trying to contact you," Grandma interrupted, and my mother went completely still, her entire body locking up like a wire pulled so tight it was about to snap. "For years. You changed your name, changed your number, moved states. He couldn't find you. But then he found me." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with something unspoken, something heavy that I wasn't sure I was ready to acknowledge. My mother took a slow step forward, her breath uneven now, her voice lower, more dangerous than I had ever heard it. "You talked to him?" Grandma didn't flinch, didn't react, just nodded once. "I did," she admitted, and my mother let out a sharp breath, shaking her head in disbelief, in fury, in something closer to betrayal. "Are you insane?" My mother's voice cracked, and there was something so raw in the way she looked at her mother, something I didn't know if I was supposed to be seeing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What kind of man he is?" He's still her father," Grandma cut in, and my mother let out a sound that I wasn't sure was laughter or a sob or something in between, something broken, something full of years of pain that hadn't been allowed to surface until now. "He is not her father," she spat, and the venom in her voice made my stomach twist, made my chest ache with something I didn't know how to name. "He is a monster. A murderer. He killed the man I was supposed to marry, the man I loved, the man who would have been her father." "But he wasn't," Grandma said softly, and the silence that followed was deafening. "He wasn't her father, Lillian. And he never would have been." I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to exist in a space that suddenly felt too full of ghosts, too full of pain, too full of truths that had been hidden for so long they had rotted into something unbearable. "What does he want?" I asked again, And this time, Grandma didn't hesitate. "He wants to see you," she said, and I felt my mother's hand on my arm before I even had time to process what had just been said. "No," my mother snapped, and I had never seen her this desperate before, never seen her look at me with this much fear, with this much panic, with this much sheer terror. "You are not going anywhere near him. Do you understand me? You are not. He's getting out whether you like it or not," Grandma interrupted, and my mother's grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin now, her whole body vibrating with something violent, something she was barely keeping under control. "Then we leave," my mother said, and I felt my entire body tense at the words, my stomach twisting painfully. "We pack up, we go, we disappear. We've done it before, we do it again." "No," I said, and my mother's head snapped toward me so fast that I almost took a step back. "What do you mean?" "No," she demanded, her voice sharp, her eyes wide, wild, desperate. "I mean, I'm not running," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected it to be, even though my hands were shaking. "Not again." My mother stared at me for a long moment, her chest rising and falling quickly, her whole body trembling, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her that I had never seen before. Fear. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, and there was something so fragile in the way she looked at me now, something that made my chest ache. "I know exactly what I'm saying," I said, and when I turned back to Grandma, she didn't look surprised. "Set it up." My mother let out a sharp breath, shaking her head, stepping back like she didn't recognize me, like she didn't know who I was anymore, like I had just shattered whatever version of me she had been holding onto for all these years. "You don't know what you're doing," she whispered, and I felt something settle deep in my chest, something heavy, something irreversible. "Neither do you," I said, and for the first time in my life, my mother didn't have anything to say. My mother didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. She didn't slam doors, didn't scream, didn't try to stop me again. She just disappeared into her room, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if it was because she was angry at me or if she was just too exhausted to fight anymore. Grandma stayed in the living room, quiet, watching me like she was waiting to see if I would crack under the weight of everything. But I didn't. I sat there, still, silent, letting the reality of what I had done sink in. I had made the decision. There was no taking it back now. The meeting was set for the following week in a controlled visitation room inside the prison, and the days leading up to it stretched unbearably slow. My mother didn't try to convince me to change my mind, but I could feel the tension rolling off of her every time we were in the same room. She barely looked at me. When she did, it wasn't anger anymore, it was something worse. It was fear. She had spent my whole life keeping me away from him, building an entire world where he didn't exist, and now, in one single moment, I had shattered all of that. She didn't know what would come next. Neither did I. Grandma drove me. My mother refused to come. I didn't ask her to. The prison was cold, the walls too gray, too blank, too much like a place where time had no meaning. I followed the guard through the hallways, my stomach twisting tighter with every step, my heart beat loud in my ears. I had told myself I was ready, that I wouldn't feel anything, that I could sit across from him and leave just as empty as I had walked in. But then the door opened, and there he was. He was older than I expected, his hair mostly gray, his face sharper than mine, but still, undeniably, something I recognized. He looked at me like he had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time, like he had imagined it 1,000 different ways, but still wasn't sure how real it was. I sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You look like her," he said finally, his voice quiet, steady. "Which one?" I asked. "Both," he said, and something in my stomach twisted painfully, but I forced myself to keep my expression blank. I didn't let him control the conversation. I didn't let him decide how this would go. "Why did you want to see me?" I asked. He studied me for a long time, like he was searching for something in my face, something only he could see. "Because I never got to," he admitted. "And I thought maybe you'd want to know me too." I almost laughed. The audacity of it, the absurdity. "Know you?" I repeated. "The only thing I know about you is that you killed someone. That you ruined my mother's life. That she spent 20 years making sure I never had to sit in front of you like this. And you think I want to know you?" His face didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten slightly on the table. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, and that was the moment I felt something snap inside of me. "Don't," I said, my voice sharper than before. "Don't sit here and pretend like this was some accident, like you just lost control for a second. You stabbed a man. You made a choice. And because of that, my entire life was built on a lie." For the first time, his expression shifted. He looked away, exhaling slowly. "You're right," he said. "I made a choice. And I have lived with that choice every day since. I should have felt something then. Satisfaction, maybe. Closure. But I didn't." "You wanted to see me," I said, my voice flat. "So what do you want?" He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry," he said. That was it. That was all. I felt the disappointment settle in my chest, heavy and unshakable. Not because I wanted more from him, but because I had spent my whole life not knowing who he was, and now that I did, I realized I had been right all along. He wasn't worth knowing. I pushed my chair back, standing up. "I don't forgive you," I said, watching the words land. Watching as he processed them, as he realized I was walking away from him for good. "I don't care if you regret it. I don't care if you think about it every day. You are not my father. You never were." He inhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. He just nodded once, slowly, like he had expected this. Like he had already made peace with it. I turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, his voice stopped me one last time. "You don't have to carry this," he said. "You don't have to be anything like me." I froze. And for just 1 second, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not relief. Fear. Because the truth was, I had spent my whole life trying to outrun something I never fully understood. And now, standing here, hearing his voice, I realized that no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I told myself that I was nothing like him, I would always wonder. But wondering didn't mean believing. And it sure as hell didn't mean accepting. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, then walked through the door without another word. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me hard, like a shock to my system, pulling me back to reality. Grandma was waiting by the car, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask me how it went. She didn't need to. I climbed into the passenger seat, staring straight ahead as she started the car. The prison disappeared behind us, swallowed by distance, by time, by the past that I had finally faced. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if my mother would ever forgive me, if I had made the right choice, if this feeling in my chest would ever fade. But as we drove away, one thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. I would never see him again. And I was okay with that.